Dear Donna, I knew I wanted to do an episode on Mary, the Mary in the Bible, the mother of Jesus, because, well, it's Christmas coming up. But I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to say about her, or who might be an interesting person to talk to about Mary. One name kept popping up in my head, my friend Donna Burns. Years ago, we went to the same church. Donna's retired and she lives in Illinois now, so I thought I'd send her an email. I am writing because I'm wondering if you would like to be my conversation partner on the subject of Mary. Here are my reasons for asking you. Without ever having talked to you directly about it, my impression is that you have strong feelings about women's issues and are perhaps a feminist by some definition and a Democrat. If I'm right on all of these hunches, then you seem to me to be the kind of complex person, that is, assuming you are both a feminist and a devout follower of Christ, who might see things a little differently about Mary, and maybe a lot of other things as well. Well, it turns out that I was right about my hunches, and Donna happily agreed to be on my show. Except for one thing. We never actually got around to talking about Mary. So what we decided to do was this. We're going to make a special Part 2 episode where we just talk about Mary, and I'll release that in a few weeks. Meanwhile, here's Part 1 with Donna Eaton Burns.
You're listening to a small good thing.
You're listening to a small
good thing.
Good thing.
Small good thing with Steve Zell.
So Donna, thanks so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you for asking me. I was surprised, but pleased.
So I just want to jump right in. You are a Christian and a feminist, is that right?
Yeah, you are. I love Jesus, and I am a feminist. That takes some definition. People have, sometimes that's a very divisive sort of word. I would also call myself an egalitarian, biblical egalitarian. Sometimes that sits better with people.
All right, I want to come back to that. Before I do, we've known each other for many years, but the last time I saw you, I think, was about 3 or 4 years ago at a wonderful retirement and going away party that you were given at Mount Sac where you were working. So, maybe just to fill in the audience a little, maybe you could tell us what you were doing there at Mount Sac, and then maybe how you came to be there, and then what led to that, and so on and so forth. We'll just sort of work backwards in your biography. Is that okay?
Okay. So I ended my career at Mount San Antonio College. It's a large community college in Southern California, just over the hill from Cal Poly Pomona, which is close to your heart, I know. I was the dean of continuing education, and basically that was areas of education for adults who either were not ready for credit courses or did not need credit courses for certain vocational training programs, for example, who maybe needed to improve their basic skills or finish an adult diploma or learn English as a second language. So we had a very large ESL program. So before I became the dean, I was the director of that ESL program for, I don't know, maybe another 7 before that. And then I was adjunct professor of ESL there at Mount Sac for, I don't know, a few more years.
Yeah.
I'm old, so these years start adding up. And
So ESL,
So that
just for
was
the
my
audience, is
second.
English as second language, right?
Yes, yes. And we had a program of about 5,000 students a year who are, for the most part, immigrants. There's a few who are born here in the United States and for some reason thrived a little better in our ESL program for a while before they transitioned into credit. But mostly it was a large program of immigrants to this country.
You were in the education academic world, both as a professor and then as an administrator and finally as a dean of a department. Was that where you were always aiming? Were you always had ambitions to be in the academy and to be that? Or what came before that? What were you doing before that?
So that journey was probably the last 18 years. And then just prior to that, I retooled. So I'll go back to the beginning now. I married at 20 years old with an associate degree. Then I went to work full-time for World Vision as a research assistant because I was pretty good at writing. And 5 years later was at Mission Aviation Fellowship, and then maybe 10 years later went on to Air Serv. So all those three organizations were international Christian relief agencies in one form or another. And I, through my writing, eventually evolved into directing public relations kinds of programs and grant and fundraising kinds of programs. And then it involved some international travel. And there was one point where my daughter was preteen and I was heading out to Africa. The shuttle was coming to take me to LAX. And my daughter cried for the first time ever. She had never cried when I traveled. And I thought, okay, that's it. When I come back, I need to do something where I can be more available to her in her preteen years and teenage years. And so I retooled at that point, finished my bachelor's degree, and then got the master's in teaching ESL, which was such a gift because the world came to me. And I was able to stay connected internationally in that way.
I want to go back now to why I called you on, and I'm hoping that my audience now has a sense of a little bit about who you are and the breadth of your experience. You say you are a person who loves Jesus. Those are your words. A Christian. You have obviously a Christian commitment, that's for sure. But you're also a feminist. I have to think by now you've had some people raising their eyebrows on that. Right now, I suspect some of my, secular feminist friends are shaking their head and said, no, that's impossible. You can't be a feminist and a Christian. And I'm pretty sure I've got some of my religious Christian friends who are shaking their head in the same way, saying, no, that's impossible. You can't be a feminist and a Christian. So I guess then the question is, what do you mean by a feminist? Is there such a thing as a Christian feminist? Can you fill in some blanks on that?
Yeah, I can. Well, I can tell you what I mean. It's kind of funny because there was a lot of discussion way back in the 70s when my husband was at seminary, went to Fuller Seminary, and I can remember in the mid-70s this conference, Women in the Ministries of Christ at Fuller, and it felt like a new thing coming for women of being able to be recognized and respected as gifted leaders in the church and equally empowered to practice their gifts as God gave them. And there were books out at the time that was causing a stir in the evangelical world. And here it is, however many years it is later now, and we're still kind of wringing our hands over the notion that God created humans as male and female in his image, and he gave them as male and female dominion and stewardship over the earth. And it's right there in Genesis. And it's not a tough concept, but it's something that we haven't embraced fully, at least across the spectrum. And the dominion of man over woman came from the fall. And it wasn't God's punishment. It was the natural result of sin. And from that you see patriarchy and the degradation of women. You see it in the Old Testament, and you see violence toward women and humans acting out in ways that God never intended as a result of the fall, and one aspect of it being dominion and power of men over women. And when Christ comes, you see him really reversing that in so many ways. And there are books written on both sides that go into these things, and they've been published for, each decade a new crop comes out. So I don't want to, I'm not that kind of an expert.
Sure.
When you read enough where you know in your heart and in your own conviction, this is what I believe, and I'm done arguing about it, but I'm not an expert. I've just read enough that I've made my decision. That's kind of who I am, and I would have to refer people to resources if they really wanted to gain a different understanding about egalitarianism. Not just in marriage, but in society and in the church, in systems, across the board.
I want to talk to you more about egalitarianism. Before I do that, here's a question I have to ask, and I know that you've been asked this question, or I just instinctively know people are wondering. When I hear the word feminism, and I think most people hear the word feminism, whether they're religious people or non-religious people, either which way. When I hear the word feminism expressed in the media and other cultural outlets, feminism it seems to be always associated with a set of other ideas or beliefs or whatever you want to call it. And those other ideas that seem to be associated with feminism are abortion rights, sexual freedom rights. That's the idea that what a woman wishes to do with her body should be nobody's business but her own, and no authority or institution can make claims on that. And feminism also seems to be invariably favorable to the LGBT creeds. And these attitudes sometimes are often packaged together as justice issues. But a lot of those issues, certainly the first three, not so much justice, I think, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but those seem to be at odds with traditional and biblical Christian stances. So is your definition of feminism it doesn't seem to be the same kind of feminism that it's talked about in the media. Is that right? What would you say to that?
Well, I think you can have ideologies, and then you have civics, and you have to translate what you believe into civil law that works for everybody, or tries to work for everybody. I don't necessarily associate feminism with specific attitudes toward gay and lesbian, for example. I do associate some feminist voices with abortion rights, but I think the abortion conversation has become so unhelpful. It's ideological on both sides. Should it be legal? Should it be illegal? Instead of having conversations about how do we help women so that they don't have to make a choice to abort their baby, and how do we work in policy ways to lower the abortion rate, maybe without getting hung up on law. For example, in Democratic administrations, and I looked this up when I first read it, in Democratic administrations, the abortion rate as a percentage of pregnant women goes down. As a percentage of women, I think it is, goes down. And that's associated with having more services and healthcare support to women in poverty or lower income women, and particularly women of color. And so if we really want to help reduce abortion rates, then we should be acting in a compassionate way toward women who need the resources to make choices that will provide contraceptives, and that they can sustain a pregnancy and know that they can support a baby if they bring it to term. So much of the abortion conversation is about being pro-birth. We want babies to be born. We don't want to kill babies. But there's not as much conversation among conservative evangelicals, conservative white evangelicals in particular, about providing life through the whole spectrum, enabling poor parents to support that child after it's born. And systems that will really promote life for everyone, people of color, people who don't have resources. And when you look at the disproportionate impact of certain systems, for example, capital punishment is applied disproportionately to men of color. So if we say we're pro-life, let's examine that too. Let's be consistent in our ideology and our beliefs all the way across. And so, anyway, so going back to the feminist thing, I don't equate feminists with having a pro-abortion right agenda specifically. I think it's an outgrowth where women, especially secular feminists, would feel that women do have a right to do what they want with their body. I would like to see pro-life addressed in ways that gets rid of that fight and helps support women so that they don't have to make a choice to abort their baby. I think that's a much more productive way of addressing the issue.
I want to take one half a step back because you've mentioned it, and maybe for the sake of the audience, my audience, and maybe my own, you have mentioned a couple of times and used the word egalitarian, and you have said to me that you believe that Scripture supports egalitarian marriage and ministry, and you have distinguished that from something else that some Christians believe in or espouse, and that is a complementarian marriage. Not for just the sake of definition, not argument. What is your idea? What is exactly the meaning of an egalitarian marriage and/or ministry, and how is that? What is a complementarian marriage, and how are those things different? And why are you more on the egalitarian side?
Well, the egalitarian would go back to what I was saying earlier about creation and women and men having equal empowerment for stewardship of the earth and their gifts and in following God. And it's about equal empowerment according to their gifts. And that might mean that a woman would have a leadership position over a man, or might be pastor of a church. It would mean that women would be ordained if they were called and completed the appropriate steps that might be in place for the men in a particular denomination. In a marriage, it gets a little bit trickier, because I don't want to say as an egalitarian that somebody else's marriage should look like mine. I don't want to say that if a man and a woman in their own marriage want to choose to have what we would consider somewhat traditional roles, that shouldn't be their choice. That's their choice.
Now, when you say traditional role, is that the same thing as a complementarian marriage? What is that? No. I think complementarian, I would equate complementarian with an ideology or a system of belief that says, basically, and I'm sure I'm not doing it justice, but says that God made men and women differently. They're equal before God, but they have different roles and different strengths. And so it is not appropriate for women to do things that God made only men to do. And so women don't preach. Women aren't pastors or aren't ordained. And I've actually read one complementarian leader question whether women should have leadership positions even in the secular world over men. I've read it go that far. And so, if a woman believed in complementarian marriage, would that somehow or another bar her from the label of being a feminist? In my mind, it would. I don't know that labels help much at all. In fact, I think they're probably usually not very helpful. But if you believe ideologically in a complementarian marriage, you're believing that God has different roles for men and women, and that you're not supposed to cross those lines. Now, you might have a traditional looking marriage where a woman is not working for a salary and a man is working for a salary, and the woman tends to be home raising the kids and doing the cooking and the laundry, and they're real happy with that, and that works for them, but they're not laying it on everybody else. That's different from complementarian. Right. Yeah. Okay, I want to move on here for a second, and that is to this little second bit here. Kind of makes you an interesting person. I know your husband is always saying you're such an interesting person, Donna, and so I'm glad that you're here. Yeah. You're such a fascinating woman. I know that he's saying that all the time. So here's the second component to you, and that's this business about you are a Democrat, which again, for some people is like, no, you can't be a Democrat and a Christian. And so here's what you wrote me in one email exchange. You wrote, and this was just last week, I think. It says, here in Illinois, we are celebrating the flipping of our district and a neighboring one from red to blue. So it sounds to me like you're fairly political, that you're politically vocal, that you take not just a passive interest, but an active interest in politics. Is that correct? And number two, it doesn't sound like you were always a Democrat. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I am interested in politics. My dad actually was involved in local politics when I was growing up. He was a councilman and then a mayor, and then he became a county supervisor. So I did actually canvassing, like when I was in junior high school, for my dad. But I always have considered myself fairly moderate. I was registered Republican. I actually became independent by my late 20s. I re-registered as an independent, and I actually did vote for Jimmy Carter. I forgot about that. But I
did you vote for him as a Republican? Were you a Republican when you voted for him, or
yes,
had you already moved?
I actually was. No, I was a Republican when I voted for Carter. And it was interesting. I remember how Christians were really big on Carter his first term, talking about how he's born again and everything. And then by the end of his term, they hated his guts. And obviously, I'm wildly generalizing.
Yes.
And I didn't understand that. I can remember, I went through a journey of saying, what about this? I don't understand this. And so
I'm always interested in how and why people change, particularly what we would consider, at least on the surface, large changes. Fundamentally, sea change is a dramatic word, but large changes like that. Can you recount what were the mechanisms that were working upon you? I have a friend of mine that does a lot of counseling, and he says when people make big decisions, they're always running to something and away from something, or there's always a force that's attracting us and a force that's repelling us. Can you I know maybe you can't do it anymore, can you recollect what was moving you? What was the energy moving you?
Well, I tried to pay attention to outcomes as best I could as a voter. I was always one of those voters that would, in California, they mail you these big fat voter pamphlets, and I would go through them word for word and mark my ballot and look people up and really try and do a good job. And I had never voted party particularly, and I was fairly moderate. And then I started noticing during the Clinton administration, I did not vote for Clinton the first time around because I was personally repelled by the women accusations, which I believed. And but then I saw that he ended up doing a decent job, I thought, and the economy got better. And he was a Democrat, and I thought Democrats were wasteful and made bad economies, and the Republicans were the ones that made good economies, but that's not what's happening right now. And so I started just watching and listening, and in my mind, I was attracted to the concern for justice, systems of justice, and the poor that I was hearing from the Democrat side. And I was repelled by the more strident, it seemed to be increasingly strident voices from the right, particularly after the late 70s when the moral majority really rose up and started associating white evangelicals with right-wing politics. And I was very repelled by that, voted for Obama. And then I remember, and I told you about this in the email, I was driving to work about 10 years ago, maybe not that. Obama was in still his early years, and they were working on the Affordable Care Act and going back and forth and trying to get compromise and get something done. And the Republicans were withholding approval on providing health care for the first responders to 9/11 who were suffering health problems from having gone in to rescue people, and the Republicans were holding back on funding for that in order to force a deal. And I heard it on the radio. It was a PBS talk show on my way to work, and I thought to myself, and actually I was an independent anyway by then, but I said to myself, I can't be a Republican and a Christian anymore. I can't do this. Now, I'm not saying people can't be Republican and Christian. I'm not saying those are mutually exclusive, but I am saying that I couldn't be anymore.
Right.
I just don't see Jesus working to keep things away from those who need it. So that was the conversion point for me to actually register as a Democrat.
So one question I sometimes ask my guests is this. If you could say one thing to my secular, feminist, democratic friends, something that you think might just be important for them to know or that you'd want them to know, what would that be?
Well, I would say to them that the whole Christian identity in America is a lot more, well, in the world, but in our political environment, it's a lot more nuanced than it might appear from what you hear in the media. And there are evangelicals across the spectrum of politics. There are evangelicals who are culturally very different from one another, based on ethnicity or even region that you live in. And so I would encourage them to not assume that evangelicals are all alike, even though they've all been bunched into one lump now in the media in particular, and that Christians, real solid Christians, would not necessarily identify themselves as evangelical at all. There's a lot of Christians that have just found that term doesn't work for them at all, and they used to be evangelical. They used to find that term useful, and it doesn't anymore.
The second question I would ask you is, if you were going to speak to my religious or Christian friends, listeners, and you wanted them to know, you wanted to leave them with just a word or one thing to think about, what would that be?
You can't have, this verse you vote this way and this verse you vote this way. You have to think more deeply about faith, and you have to study the scripture and listen to smarter and more scholarly voices than our own. Otherwise, you have a very thin faith that relies on verses here and there that you like and an emotional experience at church and whatever you might remember from what the pastor said. And then that's what you have as a Christian. So I would say listen to voices that are different from your own comfort zone. And that is easy to do. It's really easy to do nowadays with Twitter, believe it or not. I am following more voices, not just Christian voices, political voices, other voices about social issues, just trying to listen to them and learn from them and understand their point of view. And I don't engage. I guess you'd call me a lurker, but it's with a good intention of learning. And if you start with one good voice and see who they follow and who they retweet, you start to learn who some thought leaders are that are really strong Christians. For example, I'll just give you an example. Real strong Christians who are people of color who are really strong on naming justice issues that we need to work on in this country. And they're solid people, and I need to listen to them. And I think that's true for all Christians, particularly white Christians.
Old white Christians like me.
And me.
If you would like to go deeper into how Christians might engage in some of the issues that we talked about surrounding women or justice, be sure to see the show notes for some resources that Donna has included there. The music this time is by Lobo Loco, Blue Dot, and Daniel Birch. And next time, part 2 of my conversation with Donna, and this time we get around to talking about Mary. Also, in keeping with the Christmas spirit, I'm putting together what I hope to be a fun short program that I'm calling Podcast Presents. I ask some of my past guests and maybe even listeners to take 3 or 4 minutes to tell us what other podcasts they listen to regularly. By the end of that show, my theory is we should have a lot of nice recommendations for the coming new year. I hope you heard some small good thing in this episode. If you did, maybe share it with somebody else.